pleasure to be here and to share some ideas with you that I've come to know is radical healing. I also know that I always love being in competition with salmon, so it's all good. I bring you greetings from the sovereign and independent nation of Oakland, California. Go Dubs. In my work in Oakland, I've been working with youth in Oakland and researching youth in Oakland for over 25 years. And I've become more and more interested, not so much in the strategies or not so much in the specific processes that support youth, but I've become much more interested in the heart, in the ways in which our sense of hope, the ways in which our loving relationships actually have an opportunity to transform the lives of young people. Yesterday I mentioned that I'm really interested and curious about what it looks like to scale love in public policy. How might loving relationships transform the ways in which we think about supporting young people in the really most challenging and difficult situations? And so what I hope to share with you today is not so much a specific strategy, but leave with you a message of hope so that we begin to shift our thinking about young people and we begin to think about the ways in which our hearts have a profound impact to reshape public policy. I want to start with a small story. I'm oftentimes asked to speak at conferences around the country. And I was asked to speak at this is the first time I've ever had an opportunity to speak at a prison. And this is a prison in California. And I'd never spoken at a prison. Usually there are conferences or at a school. And so I debated whether or not I was going to take the invitation. So they called me 2 or 3 times, and so I decided finally, I'm like, I'll go to the prison. Apparently, there had been several inmates who had gotten one of my books and was reading the book, and they asked me to come and speak. So I reluctantly accepted the invitation and drove out about an hour from my home in Oakland out to the prison. When I got to the prison, I had to show them my ID, and they buzzed me in, and I told them that I was there for the talk. And the prisons are very interesting places, right? So as I began to ask for where I was going to speak, they began to give me a set of instructions. The first instruction they said is, follow the yellow line until the end of the corridor, right? So I followed the yellow line until the end of the corridor as they directed me to where I would be speaking. I got to the end of the corridor, and there's a door. They buzzed the door open. Bzz. I walked into the door shut behind me. Boom. The next guard said, follow the green line all the way down to the corridor. So I followed the green line all the way to the corridor to the next exit, or to the next door. And there was a door, they buzzed me in. Bzz. I walked through it. Boom, and the door shut behind me. The next correctional officer said the same thing, follow the blue line, and I did the same thing. By the time I got to the blue line, the third door shut behind me, boom, I began to feel the sense of incarceration. Right? I began to feel that the men that I was about to talk to hadn't felt the warm sun on their faces. They hadn't smelled the freshness of rain. They hadn't heard the birds. And I began to feel the spirit of incarceration. So finally, I got to the auditorium where I was supposed to get what I was giving the talk. And when I got to the auditorium, I was awestruck. I had expected about 10 men to show up into the auditorium, and I thought we would have a sort of a book club. When I got to the auditorium, there were about 200 inmates and tables anxiously awaiting me to talk to them. I was taken back. And as I was sort of preparing my notes and talking, the men came up to me, a couple of men came up to me, and they said, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here. We really look forward to hearing what you have to say. And we're just excited. He said, my name is Chris. I said, hey, Chris, how you doing? He said, I've been in here since 1987. Wow, it really hit me. Another man came up to me. He said, hey, Dr. G, we're glad you're here. We read your book. My name is Greg. I've been here since 1985. And one by one, they began to not tell me why they were here, but how long they had been here. And as they began to tell their stories, 1985, 1987, my humanity began to grow. And I felt inadequate to talk to them. I took my speech that I had prepared, and actually tore it up and put it to the side. And I began to feel like, what could I tell these men that could somehow have an impact on their lives when I know that they hadn't hugged their daughters, they hadn't played with their sons, they hadn't embraced their mothers or fathers in over 20 years. So when I came up to the podium, I didn't know what I was going to say, right? And so what I did is I just spoke from my heart. I told them about my son. I told them about the challenges I was having raising a 16-year-old young man. I talked about the way I grew up, where I grew up. I talked about growing up in the South. I just shared stories with them, and I talked to them about the possibility of hope. That no matter what conditions we're in, we all have the ability to imagine another way of being. And I talked for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I left the stage really not aware of what I had even said. As I left the stage, the correctional officers immediately surrounded me. They said, "Okay, Dr. Ginwright, it's time for you to come." And so as they were ushering me out of the auditorium, I heard a voice behind me. It said, "Hey, Dr. G." I was like, "Who's that?" So I turned around, and there was literally, this brother must have been 7 feet tall, 300 pounds, right? It's not exaggeration. I turned around. He said, "Hey, man, I got to tell you something." And I said, "What's up, man? What you want to tell me?" He said, "Man, your words really touched me, right? The way the stories you shared, man, they really touched me, man. I want to let you know I really appreciate it." I'm like, "Great, I got to go now, but I really appreciate it." He said, "No, I need you to listen to me, brother." He said, "It really touched me." He had a scar that went down his face. He said, "You see this scar on my face?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "About a few years in here, man, it's really dangerous. And people think they think I'm mean, they think I'm tough. And a couple of years ago, I got in a fight and they cut my face. But I'm really gentle, right? I'm really a gentle brother, man. And they cut my face, and I have to find ways to sustain my sense of healing and peace in here." And I said, "Wow, man, I'm sorry to hear that," right? He said, "I do things in here to keep my own sense of peace and well-being." And he reached into his pocket. You can put the PowerPoint slide on now. He reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a little bottle. And he opened up the bottle, and he undid it. And I said, "What has he got in the bottle?" He opened up the bottle, and he blew bubbles. And the bubbles floated over my head. And he blew bubbles. He said, these bubbles reminds me when I was a child. And even in this situation where it's really hard, man, when I blow bubbles, it gives me a sense of hope. And I thought to myself, did this big brother just blow bubbles in my face in a prison? But he began to tell me about the meaning of bubbles for him. When he blows them, it reminds him of his childhood. When he uses bubbles, it reminds him, it keeps him calm. It reminds him of how he can sustain his own sense of peace and hope that one day he can show his children how to blow bubbles. And when I left the prison, I was reflecting on that story. And I thought to myself that in many ways, we all have our own bubble stories. That there are practices that we use to sustain and create spaces of hope for our own selves. The challenges that we face in our lives, the challenges that we face in our work lives, that in some ways we're always striving, we're always reaching to create that space of hope and healing. His was bubbles. And I began to become curious as to how people around the country have their own bubble stories. When schools are defunded, what are the bubble stories that teachers use to create a space of hope? When young people are growing up in violent neighborhoods with gun violence, how do community organizations create their bubble stories and their spaces of hope? So in my book, Hope and Healing in Urban Education, I try to document those stories. I want to tell the stories about hope, and the courageous ways in which young people are engaging in hopeful opportunities. The courageous act of love where adults are disrupting the normal policy practices and creating courageous ways of young people to create relationships with them that reduce violence. And so I wanted to tell those stories. And so in the book, it highlights a number of stories about hope. But first, we have to understand is that there are challenges to hope, right? That when we think about hope, it is not oftentimes an individual act. That hope oftentimes is contingent upon or supported by the environment in which it occurs. I was sharing these ideas with my son, who's now at UCLA, and I was giving this talk. He said, "Dad, have you ever listened to Kendrick Lamar?" He said, Kendrick Lamar is y'all know who Kendrick Lamar is, right? That's right, Kendrick. So he said, there's a song that Kendrick Lamar, in his album called Good Kid, Mad City, and Kendrick Lamar talks about, I'm a good kid in a mad city. I'm a good kid who wants to go to school, but sometimes I have to navigate my way to school. Sometimes I have to take this turn on this corner and go this way to avoid some people, but I'm a good kid in a mad city. Sometimes I have to be concerned and think about the police and what they believe about me. I'm a good kid, though, in a mad city. What Kendrick Lamar is teaching us is the same thing that social science teaches us, right? James Gabarino calls it social toxicity. The idea that the environments that sometimes we grow up in, the environments that we work in, are toxic, just like there are physical toxins in a neighborhood or in a building, asbestos or lead paint, that your exposure to asbestos and lead paint over time can make you ill. And if you don't heal from that exposure to lead paint, it can become lethal. Well, James Gabarino says in a similar way that young people are exposed to social toxicity, and social toxins are things like fear, anxiety, uncertainty, stress, shame, right? All of these things form an elixir, a toxic elixir that young people find themselves in their neighborhoods and schools that sometimes can become overwhelming. The question is how are schools and how are after-schools programs responding to that sense of social toxicity? James Farmer calls it structural violence, right? And that is that hope is not only an individual act, but it is situated in a broader environment. So when we think about structural violence, we have to look at the kinds of policies, like zero-tolerance policies, that oftentimes create the school-to-prison pipeline. But structural violence also sometimes happens in classrooms, right? The perceptions that teachers and sometimes schools have of students. You remember this scene at Spring Valley High School in South Carolina, where a young girl was on her phone. You may have remembered this going around on Twitter not long ago. It was on her phone. The teacher says, "Put away your phone," and the student says something. The principal comes in, "Put away your phone." The student refuses to put the phone in, and then they bring in the police officer. And what occurs next is that the police officer, believing that the student, who is basically defiant, is a threat to safety, and takes the student, flips her out of the seat, and drags her out of the classroom, right? These are socially toxic environments. And even though this is the most egregious example, they still sometimes just the belief and the attitude. These things happen in schools. You may remember not long ago in St. Petersburg, Florida, this was a 5-year-old girl that was having a temper tantrum. The temper tantrum resulted in a police officer coming into the school and handcuffing the girl. Now, again, these are egregious examples of social toxicity and structural violence, right? And that the attitudes and the beliefs that we have about young people are sometimes not just our own, but they're embedded in the systems. And that unless we're able to situate hope and hopeful situations in these contexts, right, we also have to be mindful that the context needs to change as well as the social emotional health of young people. I want to take you on a little trip to Oakland, where I live, and trying to look at the social toxicity that exists in physical space in Oakland, California. This is a map of Oakland. Oakland is divided into the flatlands and the hills, which is also an economically, the wealthy and more middle class live in the hills, and the flatlands are primarily working class and poor. Every year, the Oakland Tribune publishes an issue about homicides. And what they do is they sort of map the homicides in Oakland. And so this is a map that kind of shows where the homicides existed. Of course, you can see most of them happen in the flatlands. And this is in 2002. This is in 2003, there were 114. In 2004, there were 88. 2006, there were 94. In 2006, there were 146. And this is a picture of the 5-year total, right? So if you look at this map, right, this is a 5-year total, 555 homicides in this geographic space. The question is, around this structural violence, is how are teachers, how are adult workers working after school programs responding to these questions and these experiences for young people? What is the possibilities of building hope in these types of environments? Hopelessness, research suggests, is a predictor of violent behavior. Hopelessness is a predictor of fatalism. Hopelessness is a predictor of depression, and it goes on and on and on. That these environments sometimes create a space of hopelessness. And it's important that we try to look at how youth workers and teachers are actually supported in dealing with these issues. Unfortunately, our professional development doesn't necessarily prepare us to deal with existential questions that young people face. What are existential questions? Questions about meaning. Why am I here? Questions about purpose. Where is my life going? Questions about aspirations. Where should I be going? Right? Teachers are oftentimes trained, and social workers and youth development professionals are often trained to think about issues in the context of the program or the classroom. But research suggests that 60% of what happens in the classroom is oftentimes social emotional, and that we think that learning is happening, but schools are much about social emotional space as they are about learning space. But these questions of existential questions about meaning and hopelessness, that sometimes teachers are not supported in a way to give them an opportunity and a space to connect and have conversations with young people in ways that lead them from hopelessness to hope. So what is hope, right? This is a conference on hope, and I'm sure you're familiar with Snyder's work on hope that allows us to understand the pathways to hope. There are 3 sort of ingredients that need to be in place to sort of think about what constitutes hope. The first, he suggests, is future goal orientation, our aspirations. How is it that young people can see beyond their immediate conditions? What kind of conversations, what kind of possibilities do we have in our programs and after-school programs and classrooms that evoke an imagination? And not only for young people, but for ourselves. Research suggests that those of us who work with young people in these situations also experience trauma, right? That we need to heal, that we need to be in a space of well-being before we can give it to young people. And that requires that we move out of our own professional labels and connect with young people from the heart. The second are pathways. And pathways are what are the sort of opportunities young people have for hope and healing? How are we creating job opportunities? How are we creating opportunities for mentoring? How are we creating the pathways for young people to see themselves beyond? And the third is a sense of agency, that young people can confront and change and act in ways that change the very conditions that create and threaten their hope. My friend and colleague, Jeff Duncan Andrade, in a really powerful article called Note to Educators, Hope Required When Growing Roses in Concrete, in the Harvard Ed Review. He says that there are 3 kinds of hope. He says material hope, which is the type of hope that allows young people to understand their material conditions. Right? Hope is not some fanciful wish, but it's also looking at the concrete reality of their lives. He says Socratic hope, which is allowing and preparing young people to question, why am I in this school? Why am I experiencing this in my neighborhood? Why do other police follow me? Right? To give them the questioning to sustain and foster a sense of hope. But then he says there's a third type of hope, which he calls audacious hope. And audacious hope is healing from oppression in order to transform it. That means that hope is not just our own sort of psychological state. It means that hope is created when young people are creating the conditions that improve their sense of well-being and transforming their schools and transforming their neighborhoods. So this is a no-no, but I'm going to do it anyway. They say never put more than 4 words on a slide. There's a lot of words. Youth development and civic engagement strategies designed to engage America's most disconnected youth will only be successful to the extent that they address hopelessness and create opportunities to heal from socially toxic environments and structural violence. That is our job. Our job is to create those spaces, to create a pathway from hopelessness to hope. So what kind of conditions actually foster hope? There's a model that I'd like to share with you by Virginia O'Leary, and she says that when we experience social trauma, any form of social trauma, as an adult or as a young person, what generally happens is that our level of functioning declines. It drops, right? That social trauma can be anything from losing a job. That social trauma could be losing a loved one. That social trauma can be our concern for our children. But that it overwhelms us in such a way that it disrupts our normal level of functioning. And when our normal level of functioning declines, we have 3 options. The first option is that we just survive, right? We just get through the day, man. I just want to get through the day. If I can just get to the end of the week, I'll be okay. It's just survival. We can get to the end of the month. And so survival is just sort of maintaining one's life. But sometimes we can get enough support from our family and our friends that the second option is recovery. We can recover to our normal level of functioning. We're okay again. We could work, we can establish friendships, we can engage, but we recover back to our normal level of functioning. But there's a third level that she calls thriving, right? And thriving means that our level of functioning is more profound and more meaningful and more courageous prior to the instance of trauma. That means we're better off because it happened. If you think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? Trauma occurred in their lives, but they used that trauma and transformed it so that they can have a greater impact on young people to address the issue of drunk driving. And our own work with young people, or our own work with adults who have just been released from prison, right? Young brothers and sisters on the block, they're not going to listen to Dr. Ginwright, but they will listen to someone who just got out of prison because they had that experience with prison. It allows them to connect, relate, and form a relationship that I couldn't do. And so their level of functioning becomes much more profound as a function and result of that experience of trauma. I was explaining this concept to my friend, who is a biologist at UC Berkeley. And she says, you know what, Shawn, we have a similar thing that we do in science, in botany, right? We take these plants, right, and we try to understand the stress response that these plants have to various kinds of toxins, and we put them in a box. And what we do is we pump different types of toxic gas into the chamber. And what we do is we measure how long it takes for those plants to die, or how long it takes those plants to begin to wilt. She said, but one time we did something really interesting, right? We took those plants, the same plants, and we put them together in the same container. And we still pumped the chamber with gas, right? But something different happened in the chamber when the plants were together. The plants began to pull out different nutrients out of the soil. They pulled out different chemicals out of the soil, and the plants metabolized those nutrients and those chemicals differently, and they began to emit a gas in the chamber that cleaned up the toxic gas we were pumping in. They detoxified their own environment, right? And I think that this is the type of communities, these are the types of, I think it's a wonderful metaphor for how we should be thinking about building healing environments for our young people. How do we detoxify the environments? How do we create classrooms and after-school programs that allow for young people to thrive, even sometimes in toxic environments, right? I call that process radical healing, right? The ability to transform, right? The ability for young people to support them in ways that confront and transform the very conditions of their communities. In the book, I highlight 3 forms of hope. 3 ways that communities that I see transforming the ways in which they work with young people. The first is called relational hope, right? Using hope in a way to reduce and address and confront violence in a very, very difficult situation. This is a friend of mine, Devon Bogan. Devon has been featured on CNN and the news and has been written about in the New York Times about his different way that he's engaging and using hope to transform a very difficult neighborhood in Richmond, California. Richmond, California is about a 5-by-5-mile area that has the highest crime and gun violence probably in the state of California. For years, the city of Richmond had been spending approximately $200,000 to $300,000 a year on hiring one police officer. They decided that they needed to do something because the homicide rate and the gun violence rate in Richmond hadn't dropped, despite the fact that they were spending millions of dollars hiring more police officers. So they contacted my friend Devon Bogan, who himself was a longtime youth development professional that knew that young people are not connecting with police officers. And he had a radical idea. He said he learned from the Cure Violence theory that in any given neighborhood in America, if there are 50 homicides or 20 homicides, that probably 5 or 6 or 7 young people are responsible for that. In Richmond, there were about 80 homicides. And they were able to locate those 80 homicides to about 30 young men, children, 14, 15 years old. So he had a radical idea. Instead of getting these young men and putting them in jail, what if we got other men to embrace and love them? What if we paid people to love young men who carry guns? Well, of course, that was a crazy idea, but he went to the mayor and he went to the city council and they laughed at him. But then they decided to try it, and first they hired Joe, right? I spent some time with Joe. Joe had done 15 years in prison, and Joe knows everybody in Richmond. He knows these young people's mamas and daddies and cousins and aunts and uncles. Joe knows everybody, and he's respected in the community. And the reason that I wanted to present this case is because when I was hanging out with Joe, he said something that puzzled me, right? He said we were driving around the car, and Joe would do things like they would get out of the car and he would go talk to a young man. I remember one time as I was doing the research for my book, we were driving around in Richmond, and there were some young men hanging out on the corner, and he said, Dr. Ginwright, stay in the car because they all got guns. I was like, cool. I'm good, right? So he got out of the car and he had conversations with them, right? He said things like, hey man, I didn't see you last week. Why didn't you show up to our healing circle? And he said, well, I had to go, I need to get some groceries for my mama. He said, okay, I got you. Here's $10, right? But I need you to come. Another guy said, hey, Joe, I need to thank you, man. I need to thank you for getting cleats for my little brother, man. I couldn't do it, right? And he said something as we left that conversation. He said, hey, man, you know I love you, right? He said, I love you? Did he just say that? And the young brothers on the street corner said, yeah, man, I got love for you too. What I realized is that for the Office of Neighborhood Safety, which is the organization he worked for, their theory of change is that you can't change behavior until you have a loving relationship with that person that you want to change it with, right? And so what they pay people to do is establish loving relationships with those young people who are most unloved in our society. They hire brothers from prison. They send them on the streets to establish loving relationships. And because they have loving relationships, they don't tell the young men not to carry guns, right? They say things like, I remember one time they said, there was a shooting in the neighborhood. This is a true story. There's a shooting in the neighborhood. But because he has a relationship, they can do different things. The young man called up Joe. He said, we don't want to tell you not to shoot, but just call us first if something goes down. There's a shooting in the neighborhood. The young men came. They came to Joe, and they said, hey, man, there was a shooting in the neighborhood. We're going to go shoot him back. He said, okay, I can't tell you not to do that, but come to the office first. So they came to the office. Joe, man, we're getting ready to go roll up. Joe's like, I know you got to do that, but check it out. Let's go get some pizza. That sounds crazy, right? But this is what happened. And they said, okay, let's go get some pizza. So Joe takes them to go get pizza. And then he says, oh, now explain to me what happened. He talks them down. He talks them down. He talks them down. They were able to get pizza because they love Joe. Because Joe is like their uncle they never had or their daddy they never had, and they listen to Joe. And because they have that relationship, Joe can say, don't go shoot him up, man. And if they hire 10 people like Joe, this is what they can produce. Right? The homicide rate, the program started in 2009, and last year, the homicide rate dropped down to below 15, the first time in years the loving relationships work, right? Now, as a result of that program, the city is now adopted. These are city dollars. These are not only philanthropic dollars, these are city dollars. Devon Bogan says it takes $300,000 to hire one police officer, I can hire 4 peacekeepers or 4 fellows for that money. And guess what? That's what they're doing. Now, they're not disinvesting in the police. There's still a role for police. But the question is what else is needed to create a neighborhood that's safe? And for Devon Bogan and the Office of Neighborhood Safety, relational hope and building those loving relationships is one way to balance out policing with creating a safe neighborhood. The second type of hope is called restorative hope, right? And restorative hope is the type of hope that restores a sense of well-being and health and healing in a community. And oftentimes when we think about health and well-being, we think about it in individual ways. That is, this young person could be healthy and whole, this other person can be healthy and whole, and that we work with them on an individual basis. In Oakland and Alameda County, where I live, the pipeline or the need for mental health far exceeds the ability to deliver it. And so what happens is that young people go unhealed because there isn't an innovative, out-of-the-box, imaginative way of delivering a mental health and healing possibilities for young people. This next case study is an example of how someone thought outside the box about how to heal an entire community. This is a picture of Bayview Hunters Point in Richmond, California. This is a normal sunny day, right? Young kids are burning up a park. And a friend of mine that runs an organization, her name is Lena Miller, had worked years in Bayview Hunters Point. And she had experienced lots of loss of young people in her organization. But nothing compared to the loss of one of her youth workers. And one day somebody walked into the youth club with a gun and shot up the club with young people in there, but they actually shot one of her youth workers. When that happened, Lena lost it. She went into depression, right? She didn't know what to do with her life. She actually quit. She said, I can't do it anymore. We figured out a way actually to get Lena a sabbatical, because this type of loss, the loss of young ones and the loss of her adult youth workers, was too much. The trauma had exceeded her ability to deal with it. She needed to heal herself. We were able to raise money and support, get some philanthropic dollars to create a sabbatical, which is something everybody should be thinking about. How do you create sabbaticals in schools and sabbaticals in our workplace for people who are exposed to this kind of stress? She took about 6 months, and she came back and she said, you know what? I'm coming back rethinking our work. What we need to do is not just after-school programs and teaching kids how to read, which is important. It's not that we just need to deliver one-on-one mental health. It's not that we just need to have the sports program, but we need to heal the entire community. And I was inspired by what she said. She was actually able to go to New York, and she saw the Harlem's Children's Zone. And she spoke with Jeff, and Jeff said, we can't think about this in a onesie-twosie way, Lena. And she came back and said, okay, what would it look like to heal a zone in San Francisco? So we worked with Lena. And the first thing we did is we created a map, sort of a GIS map. And this map was produced by the city of San Francisco. The red area represents the mental health need in San Francisco. If you could see District 10 is the Baby Hunters Point community. The white dots represent where the dollars were being spent for mental health in San Francisco. You see that? So at first she realized that where there was mental health need, there was very few or no resources for mental health. So she said, the first thing we need to do is let people see this map, and so she began knocking on doors, and she went into the housing projects. And when she began talking about mental health, the people in the housing projects in the community said, you know what, you're right, but we don't want to lay on somebody's couch, right? We want to have yoga. We want to have spas. We want to have everything that they have in the suburbs to facilitate mental health. So Lena came with the radical idea that we don't need just a health center, but we need to saturate this community with healing opportunities. How do we train barbers in barbershops to have healing conversations with young brothers as they sit in the chair? How do we train the beauty salon to have healing conversations with young women as they're getting their hair done? How do we actually train young people to facilitate their own mental health? Right? She began to think outside of the box. So she organized young people, she organized the residents to shift these dollars. You see the white dots moving into these areas, right? She lobbied and organized for dollars to be shifted from the low-need mental health neighborhoods into where it needed it most. When I talked to her about this, she said, Shawn, the red area is like this is like the infection, right? It's like the infection part of the city, and the white dots are like the medicine. And we need to take the medicine over there and move it into the neighborhoods that need it most. When she reimagined how those dollars should be spent, they successfully raised $1 million from the city as a first step. And as we speak, they're building yoga studios and housing projects, right? They are actually having healing circles where every Wednesday night, young women and mothers and parents sit around and talk about their dreams and their hopes and their aspirations, right? They're building community gardens. She's recreating and rethinking and reimagining how to saturate a community with hope, right? The last is sort of political. It's called political hope, right? And political hope is our ability to act in ways that change those very conditions, to look at public policy in a different way, and to engage young people in transforming the ways in which dollars are spent in their neighborhoods and communities. In Los Angeles, Latino and African American young people had been disproportionately represented in suspensions and expulsions for this little policy, right? This little piece in a policy called zero tolerance, right? But the piece of it, language, is called willful defiance. Willful defiance allows for a teacher to send a student out of class that gets them expelled or gets them suspended for whatever reason they believe and the way in which they interpret what is willful defiance. So a kid could be in class in a hat. Take your hat off, please. The kid doesn't take his hat off. He may say something to the teacher, and the teacher says, get the hell out of my classroom. The student goes out of the classroom, he's suspended, and so on and so forth. Right? So the students recognize that that little term, willful defiance, had a significant impact on teachers' perceptions of which students were being defiant. So they organized, they partnered with adults to get that language removed from the language in LAUSD policy. So in 2013, right, they partnered with an organization called the Brother Sister Soul Coalition, and they were able to end those suspensions by removing the willful defiance language. In 2014, they were actually able to invest $4.2 million in restorative justice practices. So it's not that we're removing willful defiance, but the young people are saying we want restorative practices in our schools instead of punitive ones. And then last year, in 2015, they got an additional of $13 million that was going to fund police officers and going to fund like security guards. They got that to go, additional dollars to go towards restorative justice funding in their schools, in Los Angeles schools. So these are examples of political hope, right? And I think that there are a couple of lessons that we all need to be thinking about in terms of what are the practices that build hope and healing and equity in our schools and community organizations, right? And there are just 4. The first practice is build practice that supports your own healing and well-being. And that sounds radical, that sounds crazy, right? We're thinking about young people. But if we're not well, young people can't be well. So how are we thinking about having healing circles in our work? I always say that I don't do professional development, I do personal transformation, right? Because we're human in this work, and it affects us as well. The second is to create opportunities to build loving, courageous relationships with young people. We also have to build loving, courageous relationships with ourselves. How do we relate to one another, right? What do we use in our professional development seminars and practices that actually build relationships? The third is to create healing circles that are focused on healing, not conversation circles, right? In the workshop, I suggested that the most powerful thing we can do with young people is to simply tell our story in an honest way, right? To tell our story so that our humanity shows up and not our professional degree, right? When we tell our story in an honest way, it gives young people the permission to do the same. And it establishes a relationship that we can remember and can be leveraged into kind of behaviors that we want to see from young people. And then the fourth is support young people with creating justice in their communities. That young people can see the inequality. Young people can see how there's an inequality in how terms of resources are spent. And our goal sometimes is to support young people with reimagining their communities and support them with creating options and opportunities to create the kind of communities they want to see. I'd like to end with this quote from Dr. King. And he says that one of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites. And what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Go love our children. Thank you.